You're trying to stay on top of things, right?
Yeah.
Scrolling through news, maybe research papers, wanting to get the real story without drowning in details. We know how that feels.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And that's exactly why we do the deep dive. We take these big, complex topics, dig through the key info, and pull out the insights you actually need. Hopefully give you that aha moment.
Right, it's about finding the signal in all the noise. We look at the source material and say, okay, what's really important for you to understand here?
So today, we're tackling something huge, something that really changed everything for everyone. The origins of the virus that caused the pandemic. And our main guide for this is the book Viral by Alina and Matt Ridley.
It's incredibly thorough, pulls together scientific studies, news reports, what experts were saying. It's all in there.
Our mission then is to unpack the most compelling bits from the book about how this virus actually emerged. We'll walk you through the different ideas, the evidence.
And crucially, flag the key takeaways for you. What does the book suggest we should really be focusing on?
Okay, let's set the scene. The book starts by reminding us what things were like just before. Well, before. In 2019.
Yeah, it's easy to forget, but there was this feeling, almost an optimism, that we were actually making huge strides against infectious diseases.
Right. Smallpox gone, polio nearly eradicated, massive progress against AIDS. It felt like we had a handle on things.
We did, in many ways, but the book makes this really sharp point. That same modern world, with all its global travel, dense cities, it was actually kind of like dry tinder, perfectly set up for a pandemic spark.
A very interconnected tinderbox.
Exactly. One spark and whoosh.
And then that spark hit, the pandemic's impact. I mean, the book captures it so vividly, totally disrupted the economy.
Social isolation canceled everything, just immense.
And understanding where it all started, it isn't just academic curiosity, is it? It's fundamental if we want to prevent the next one.
Absolutely. You need to know how the last fire started to stop the next wildfire. It's that basic.
So where did this fire begin? The book brings us to Wuhan, China. December 2019, doctors start seeing this strange cluster of pneumonia cases.
And pretty quickly, as you'll remember, the Huanan seafood market became the main suspect, the initial focus. And the book stresses this wasn't completely out of the blue. The SARS epidemic, back in 2002, 2003, also in China, in Guangdong.
Also linked to wildlife markets.
Precisely. The trade in exotic animals for food, that precedent was strong.
It's quite a parallel. The book even mentions the very first known SARS case, Foshan City, in November 2002. The person had prepared, believe it or not, domestic cat and snake for dinner.
Apparently, cat meat was a local delicacy there. It's a detail that really grounds the wildlife connection theory for SARS.
Yeah, here's where the book draws an interesting contrast. China's response to SARS back then versus later criticisms during COVID.
Yeah, in 2003, the WHO was actually quite critical of China's lack of openness. They issued global alerts, travel warnings, based on the data emerging, even if Beijing wasn't fully cooperating.
And the book recounts this incredible story from the SARS outbreak. When a WHO team finally got to Beijing, local officials apparently scrambled to hide SARS patients, moving them between hospitals, putting them in ambulances, even hotels.
Just to downplay how bad it was.
It really shows this struggle to get accurate, timely information in those critical early days, a real challenge.
It points to a recurring problem in global health crises, doesn't it? Transparency. The book then contrasts this with Taiwan, early January 2020.
Right. While the WHO is still saying no clear evidence of human-to-human spread.
Taiwan wasn't waiting. They sent their own experts to Wuhan. And based on what they saw, they concluded, yeah, this thing is definitely spreading between people.
And it's worth just pausing here to remember, as the book implicitly raises, Taiwan, despite its early effective response, is consistently shut out of the WHO.
Because of objections from China? Yeah.
It makes you think about the flow of information, doesn't it, in a global health emergency?
It really does. What gets missed? Whose warnings aren't heard? The book also brings up a couple of, let's say, intriguing events from before the official outbreak timeline.
Oh yeah, the Wuhan Military World Games, October 2019.
And this emergency drill at Wuhan Airport in September 2019. Apparently, the drill scenario was specifically for a novel coronavirus outbreak.
That timing is interesting. And there were these anecdotal reports, right? Athletes from different countries getting sick during or after the games, symptoms that sounded a lot like COVID.
But the book notes there wasn't much, if any, real follow-up on those reports. No systematic investigation.
So for you listening, what's the takeaway here? These early whispers, these maybe cases, they show just how hard it is to catch the very first sparks and why surveillance needs to be incredibly sharp.
Definitely. And the book really drives home how difficult it was to know the true number of cases early on in Wuhan. By mid-January 2020, some estimates were already in the thousands.
Suggesting what we saw, the severe pneumonia cases, was just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. A huge number of milder infections were likely already spreading undetected. That classic iceberg effect.
Okay, so the book then takes this fascinating turn. It shifts the focus way back to 2012 to a copper mine in Mojiang, Yunnan province.
Ah, yes, the Mojiang mine incident. This is where things get really, really curious.
So 6 miners there get hit with this severe pneumonia-like illness.
And tragically, 3 of them die. The local doctor first thought maybe it was a fungus from the mine, but antifungal drugs didn't work.
So they brought in the big guns, Dr. Zhang Nanshan, the SARS expert we mentioned earlier.
Right, and drawing on his SARS experience, he suspected it wasn't fungal. He thought, this looks viral.
And his advice, based on SARS lessons, was specific. Identify the bats in the mine, test the sick miners for SARS virus, use broad-spectrum drugs just in case, and crucially, manage their breathing, their airways.
But even with that expertise, 3 lives were lost. It was clearly something very serious.
Now, fast forward, journalists later try to find this mine, investigate the story, and the book says it was surprisingly difficult.
Yeah, its exact location wasn't widely known. Until, remarkably, the coordinates turned up in a PhD thesis from 2016. From Dr. George Gao's lab, no less.
And that thesis specifically linked the mine
to bat coronaviruses. So you have this early documented link, mysterious deadly illness in miners, same location, bat coronaviruses present. Years before COVID.
And the book points out this kind of strange situation afterwards. The Chinese government seemed pretty diligent about keeping people away from the mine. Fences, guards.
But according to the book, there seemed to be less obvious urgency about figuring out exactly what killed those miners back in 2012. It's presented as a bit of a contradiction.
It does seem odd. Keep people out, but maybe don't dig too deep into why it was dangerous.
The book even adds a bit of historical flavor, mentioning satellite images showing mining activity there in 2012, its history during the Great Leap Forward. It paints a picture of this specific place having this significant dark event in its recent past.
So the question the book leaves hanging for you, the listener, is, why wasn't this fatal outbreak linked to bats more thoroughly investigated back then? It feels like a missed signal.
A huge potential missed signal, which leads us directly to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the WIV, and its leading bat coronavirus expert, Dr. Shi Zhengli.
Often called Batwoman.
Right. So after the first SARS outbreak, Dr. Shi and the WIV became world leaders in studying bat coronaviruses. It made sense. SARS itself was traced back to bats in Yunnan province.
The book describes their fieldwork sounds pretty intense. Going into caves, netting bats, swabbing them, collecting droppings.
Definitely not a desk job, and it involved major international collaboration. The WIV worked very closely with the EcoHealth Alliance, headed by Dr. Peter Daszak.
Through programs like USAID's Predict Project, aimed at finding potentially pandemic viruses before they spill over.
And their focus was heavily on those Yunnan caves. They found quite a few SARS-like coronaviruses, like RSSHC014 and RS3367, about 95% similar to the original SARS virus. Proof these kinds of viruses were definitely circulating in bats.
Okay, now here comes the bombshell connection to Mojiang. As the book lays out, researchers found that this new virus in Wuhan, SARS-CoV-2,
was a 98.7% match to a virus called BDCO 4991.
And where did BDCO 4991 come from?
It was found in bat samples collected from that same Mojiang mine back in 2013, collected by the WIV.
Wow, okay, 98.7% identical. That's incredibly close. The closest known relative at the time.
Extremely close. But then the book highlights something odd happened. The WIV later referred to this virus as RATG13.
A different name for the same virus.
Essentially, yes. And the book notes there was a significant delay before Dr. Shame publicly confirmed that RA4991 and RATG13 were indeed the same virus sample. There were also some changes made to its database entry.
And Dr. Daszak's initial responses when asked about it.
Described in the book as curious, maybe a bit evasive. So the big question the book raises for you here is, why the rename? Why the initial lack of clarity about this crucial virus from the Mojiang mine?
And the timeline gets trickier, too. The book says Dr. Shi eventually clarified that the full genome of RATG13 wasn't sequenced after the COVID outbreak started, as some early reports implied.
But actually back in 2018.
So they'd had the full sequence for potentially a couple of years before the pandemic hit.
That's what the revised timeline suggests. So the book hammers on these key questions. Why the name change? Why obscure the link to the Mojiang miners? Why the confusion over when it was fully sequenced? These discrepancies, these unanswered questions, they inevitably fuel speculation about the origins.
They really do hang in the air.
Okay.
Okay, so moving from the viruses themselves to their structure,
Mm.
the book gets into the genetics. Specifically, this thing called the furin cleavage site.
Right. So the spike protein, that's the bit the virus uses to grab onto our cells, onto the ACE2 receptor.
Like a key fitting into a lock.
Exactly. Now, SARS-CoV-2 has this extra feature on its spike protein key, the furin cleavage site, that its closest known bat virus relatives, including RATD13, don't have.
And what does this site do?
It makes the key work much, much better in human cells. It gets snipped by an enzyme in our bodies called furin, and this primes the virus, making it way more efficient at infecting cells and spreading between people.
So it's like a performance enhancement for the virus.
A significant one, yeah. Think of it like pre-cutting the key so it slides into the lock much more easily. The book explains this is a major reason SARS-CoV-2 was so good at spreading right from the start.
The book also touches briefly on how scientists actually analyze these virus genomes. It uses an analogy to studying texts, like literature.
Yeah, looking for patterns, changes, relationships. They look at tiny changes in the RNA code. Some changes, called synonymous, don't alter the protein the virus makes. Others, non-synonymous, do change the protein structure.
Like changing a word in a sentence versus changing the meaning entirely.
Exactly. Both types of changes leave clues, like fingerprints, about the virus's history and evolution, where it might have come from, what it's related to.
This analysis and the presence of that unique furin cleavage site leads us into a really controversial area the book explores, gain-to-function research.
Mm-hmm. And relatedly, lab safety.
First, what is gain-of-function research? The book defines it simply as research that gives a pathogen, like a virus, a new ability or enhances an existing one, makes it stronger or more transmissible or able to infect a new host.
And it discusses some famous and quite contentious examples, like experiments done on H5N1 bird flu virus years ago.
Koika and Fushi's labs.
Right. They manipulated bird flu to make it spread through the air between mammals, ferrets in this case. That sparked a huge debate about the risks versus the benefits. Could we accidentally create a pandemic virus?
A very legitimate fear. The book also mentions Dr. Ralph Barich's pioneering work on manipulating coronavirus genomes, including developing methods.
The no-seam or seamless ligation method. Basically, ways to stitch pieces of viral genomes together without leaving obvious genetic scars or markers that it had been engineered.
That's pretty significant, given the debate around SARS-CoV-2's origins. The book also talks about specific experiments creating chimeric viruses hybrids.
Yes, like work done in Dr. Barich's lab by Dr. Vineet Manakari. They took a SARS virus adapted to mice and swapped in the spike protein from a newly discovered bat coronavirus, SHC-012.
And what happened?
The resulting chimeric virus was highly virulent in mice, much more dangerous than the original mouse virus, and it was resistant to existing SARS vaccines and treatments.
Wow. So these experiments really proved you could make existing coronaviruses potentially more dangerous through lab manipulation.
Absolutely. And the book uses this to highlight the dual nature of the risk. There's the natural risk of virus jumping from bats, maybe through another animal, to humans, zoonosis.
And then there's this other risk.
The risk that the very research designed to understand and fight these viruses could accidentally lead to an outbreak itself, either through creating a more dangerous virus or simply through accidental exposure to a natural one being studied.
And it's not just a hypothetical risk, is it? The book reminds us of actual lab leaks.
With the first SARS virus, after the main epidemic was over, there were separate lab escapes in Singapore, Taiwan, and Beijing.
Leading to infections, quarantines.
And in one case in Beijing, tragically, a death, the mother of one of the infected lab workers.
And the book stresses these weren't necessarily caused by, like, major explosions or anything. Sometimes it's just a procedural error, a moment's lapse in concentration. Accidents happen.
They do, and the book broadens the context, mentioning other biosafety incidents worldwide. Leopards escaping a wildlife park in Hangzhou.
Problems at the U.S. Army's Fort Detrick lab that led to a temporary shutdown.
The anthrax letter attacks in the U.S. back in 2001. The point is, handling dangerous biological materials carries inherent risks everywhere. It's not a problem unique to one country or one lab.
So all this context, the research being done, the known risks, the history of lab accidents, It sets the stage for considering the alternative origin story the book examines in depth, the laboratory origin hypothesis.
Right. And it's important to distinguish this, as the book does, from the idea of the virus being deliberately engineered as a bioweapon. The lab leak hypothesis is generally about an accident.
Okay, so what's the core reasoning behind this hypothesis as presented in the book?
Several key points. One, the pandemic started in Wuhan, the city that hosts China's premier coronavirus research lab, the WIV proximity.
2. The WIV had the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses, including, as we've discussed, RATG13, the closest known relative.
Yeah.
They were actively studying these viruses.
3. The nature of the research itself, including gain-of-function studies and collecting samples in the field, carries inherent risks of accidental exposure for researchers, either in the lab or out in the caves.
And what other evidence does the book suggest supports looking closely at this possibility?
Well, there's the fact that nearly 2 years into the pandemic when the book was written, and still today, no definitive intermediate animal host has been found. Unlike SARS-1, where civets were identified relatively quickly.
That intermediate step seems to be missing.
It does. And also, SARS-CoV-2 seemed remarkably well adapted to humans right from the beginning. It spread incredibly efficiently. The original SARS virus took months to adapt and become good at human-to-human transmission. This new one seemed pre-adapted almost.
Which some scientists argue is more consistent with it having been studied or manipulated in a lab environment, potentially involving human cells or humanized mice.
That's one interpretation the book presents. It also discusses the big debate around that early influential paper, the proximal origin paper in Nature Medicine.
The one that strongly argued for a natural origin.
Yes. The book points out criticisms of that paper and highlights other scientific analyses, particularly focusing on the furin cleavage site, that suggest its features are unusual and might be difficult to explain solely through natural evolution in bats or an intermediate host. Some argue it looks more like something inserted artificially.
The book also circles back to RATG13, the closest relative from the Mojiang mine. Those timeline issues.
Exactly. The discrepancies in when it was sequenced, the questions around the raw data, the amplicon data being uploaded late, analysis by independent researchers like Ribera suggesting the WIV might have accessed or worked on the RATG13 sample much earlier than initially stated.
Which, if true, would contradict the narrative that it was just a sample sitting forgotten in a freezer.
Precisely. It raises questions about transparency around this critically important virus. And then there's another bombshell revelation the book covers.
Which is?
The WIV wasn't just studying RATG13. They apparently had sequences for 8 other SARS-like coronaviruses from the Mojiang mine area, which they refer to internally as the 7896 group, even more closely related to each other than RATG13 was.
8 others. And were these publicly shared?
No. According to the book, details about these viruses, their full sequences, their specific properties, any potential link to the miner's illness, none of that crucial information was shared publicly by the WIV, even after the pandemic started.
That seems extraordinary. To have a collection of viruses closely related to the pandemic strain, from a mine where people died of a similar illness, and not share the details.
It's presented in the book as a major point of concern and a significant lack of transparency. Why keep that data secret?
And speaking of missing data, there's the WIV's main virus database.
Right. It went offline in September 2019, shortly before the outbreak, and the book notes various explanations have been given, like security concerns after hacking attempts.
But it remains inaccessible to outside researchers. And Dr. Daszak's comment is mentioned again.
Yeah, his statement that despite his close collaboration with the WIV, he didn't actually ask to see the data in the database during the Origins investigation. The book finds this surprising.
The book also mentions the U.S. State Department releasing a fact sheet in January 2021 outlining concerns about research activities at the WIV, including undisclosed gain-of-function work and possible prior infections among lab staff in autumn 2019.
Adding another layer of official international concern and scrutiny focused on the Institute.
Okay, so that leads us to the official investigation, the joint China-WHO mission to Wuhan in early 2021. How does the book portray that effort?
Pretty critically, overall. It questions the level of access the international team actually had and the independence of their findings.
It mentions statements by Dr. Peter Ben Embrek, who led the WHO team on the ground, that seemed perhaps overly trusting of the information provided by their Chinese counterparts, particularly regarding transparency at the WIV.
And it points out the investigation seemed very focused on the high-security BSL-4 lab at the WIV.
The maximum containment lab.
Right. But the book argues that most of the risky coronavirus research, including work with RATG13 and potentially gain-of-function studies, was likely happening at lower biosafety levels, BSL-2 or BSL-3.
Where the containment protocols are less stringent and the potential for accidental exposure might actually be higher.
Exactly. The book also revisits the issue of ascertainment bias, the fact that early cases were primarily identified through links to the Huanan market.
So if the virus started spreading elsewhere first, say near the lab, those initial cases might have been missed if they didn't go to the market.
Precisely. It could skew the picture of where the outbreak truly began. And the book notes the deeply concerning report that early patient samples from Wuhan hospitals were destroyed.
Which obviously prevents any independent reanalysis of those crucial early virus sequences.
A huge loss for the investigation. So the book contrasts the official China WHO report's main conclusion that a lab leak was extremely unlikely and favored the jump from animals via the market.
With other independent studies, like analysis by Michael Worrowby and others, looking closely at the spatial pattern of early cases linked to the market.
And those studies, the book explains, suggest the virus might have been brought into the market by infected people rather than originating from an animal at the market. Multiple introductions, perhaps.
Which would weaken the market as origin theory.
Considerably. Ultimately, the book summarizes that the China WHO report's quick dismissal of the lab leak hypothesis was met with significant criticism from many scientists globally, who felt it wasn't given a fair and thorough evaluation based on the available evidence or lack thereof.
The book then shifts focus a bit to the role of scientists themselves and how information, or sometimes misinformation, shaped the debate.
Yeah, it discusses that very influential letter published in The Lancet early on in February 2020.
The one strongly condemning conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin.
Exactly. Organized primarily by Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. The book highlights that, at the time of publication, the letter stated the signatories had no competing interests.
But later,
it emerged that Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance had directly funded coronavirus research at the WIV, creating a pretty clear potential conflict of interest that wasn't disclosed initially. Several other signatories also had lunks.
And the book suggests this Lancet letter had a powerful chilling effect, making many scientists hesitant to even discuss the possibility of a lab origin for fear of being labeled conspiracy theorists.
It definitely shaped the narrative early on. The book contrasts this with a later letter published in Science in May 2021.
Signed by a different group of very prominent scientists.
Right. And their message was different. They called for a truly rigorous, objective, and transparent investigation into all plausible origins, specifically stating that both the natural zoonosis theory and the laboratory accident theory remain viable and needed serious consideration.
A call for open scientific inquiry. The book also briefly mentions the story of Dr. Lim Yan.
The Hong Kong virologist who fled to the U.S. and claimed the virus was engineered. The book touches on her story and the intense debate and criticism surrounding her claims and motivations.
It also notes that the U.S. intelligence community conducted its own review,
but ultimately reached inconclusive findings, with different agencies leaning towards different origins but lacking definitive proof either way.
So the intelligence world was divided too. The book really underscores the critical need for transparency from all sides and for a truly independent, comprehensive investigation to learn lessons.
Absolutely. How can we prevent future pandemics if we don't fully understand how this one started?
And finally, the book gives a nod to the amateur investigators, the online sleuths.
The Drastic Collective, yeah. This decentralized group of people from various backgrounds dug through scientific papers, online databases, social media, satellite imagery, uncovering inconsistencies, asking tough questions.
The book acknowledges they played a surprisingly significant role in bringing key pieces of information, like details about the Mojiang mine and RATG13, to wider attention, often information that hadn't been highlighted by official bodies.
It shows the power of open source investigation in the modern age, I suppose.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into viral, it's abundantly clear, as the book concludes, that the origin question is far from settled. It's still very much a live debate in the scientific community.
Definitely not a closed case. The book leaves us, and you, with several major unanswered questions still hanging.
Like, what really happened to those miners in Mojiang back in 2012? What's the full story there?
And what about those 8 other closely related viruses from the same mine area, the 7896 group? What can their sequences tell us? Why haven't they been shared?
And the reasons behind the timeline changes for OKG13, the missing database. These discrepancies still need clear explanations.
They really do. So this exploration, drawing heavily on viral, it leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
Think about the implications. Depending on whether this pandemic started with a natural spillover from an animal, perhaps at a market, or through some kind of research-related incident. What does each scenario mean for the future?
How should science be conducted? How do we manage risks? What does it mean for international cooperation and transparency?
Exactly. What are the big lessons we absolutely must learn from this, regardless of the precise origin story? Because there will be future pandemic threats.
It's certainly heavy stuff to think about. The book really pushes you, and we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and look critically at information from all sides.
Understanding the nuances of how this devastating pandemic began is, well, it's not just about the past. It's absolutely crucial for preparing ourselves for whatever health challenges come next.